The thermometer outside Josiah Thorne's cabin read 20 degrees below zero, yet inside he sat in his shirt sleeves while the blizzard raged. 3 miles away, Benjamin Cross was burning his furniture to survive the night, wondering how the strange hermit trapper stayed warm without smoking himself out or depleting his firewood. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and if frontier survival innovation fascinates you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's story will reveal an even more unbelievable discovery from the 1800s. The fire in the stone hearth burned hot enough to hurt when Josiah Thorne held his hand near the flames. Yet 20 feet away, Daniel Frost shivered under 3 wool blankets. It was January of 1839 in the Wind River Range of Wyoming Territory, and their cabin felt colder inside than the forest beyond their door. Josiah added another split log to the fire. The flames roared higher. The heat rose straight up the chimney and disappeared into the winter night. Daniel had been coughing for 3 days. What started as a chest cold had progressed into something worse. His breathing sounded labored and wet. Josiah knew pneumonia when he heard it. They had adequate firewood stacked outside. They had a functioning fireplace built from river stones. They had warm blankets and hot food. But the cabin stayed brutally cold despite their best efforts. The problem was simple physics that neither man fully understood. Heat rises. Their fireplace sent most of its warmth straight up the chimney and out into the atmosphere. The portions of the cabin near the fire were tolerably warm. Everywhere else felt like standing outside. Cold air leaked through gaps in the log, chinking. The floor stayed frozen. Drafts moved constantly through the small space. Josiah kept feeding the fire, burning through their carefully gathered wood supply at an alarming rate, achieving minimal warming effect. On the 4th night of Daniel's illness, the temperature dropped to 30 below zero. Josiah stayed awake, feeding the fire continuously. He burned everything he could find, extra planks they had saved for repairs. The small bench Daniel had built, 2 wooden crates. By dawn they had consumed nearly a week's worth of firewood in a single night. The cabin had stayed just warm enough to prevent their water bucket from freezing solid. Barely. Daniel died on the morning of January 19, 1839. Josiah found him still and cold under his blankets. The fire had burned down to coals. Josiah rebuilt it, heating the cabin for a dead man, unsure what else to do. He sat beside Daniel's body for 2 hours, watching the flames send their heat uselessly up the stone chimney. They had done everything right according to frontier standards. They had shelter, fire, food, and wood. Daniel had died anyway because their cabin couldn't hold heat. Josiah buried his partner that afternoon in ground frozen, so hard he needed a pickaxe to break through. He piled stones over the grave to keep wolves away and returned to a cabin that felt more like a tomb than shelter. That night, sitting alone beside a roaring fire that warmed only the stones directly around it, Josiah began to understand something that would consume him for the next year. Fire itself wasn't the problem. How they were using fire was the problem. Heat was escaping faster than they could create it. The solution seemed impossible with available materials and knowledge. But Daniel's frozen body lying under stones on a hillside convinced Josiah that impossible was better than accepting preventable death. Josiah spent the week after Daniel's death visiting every trapper camp within 2 days' travel. He wasn't looking for company or sympathy. He was studying cabins. How they were built, how they were heated, and most importantly, how they failed to keep men alive during the worst cold. The pattern repeated everywhere. Trappers built stone or mud fireplaces against one wall with chimneys extending through the roof. They burned enormous quantities of wood, trying to heat spaces that measured perhaps 12 feet by 14 feet. They wore heavy coats inside their own shelters. They slept as close to the fire as safety allowed and still woke with frost on their blankets. Some had built their fireplaces larger, thinking more fire meant more heat. Those cabins consumed wood at staggering rates and stayed just as cold. The problem wasn't the size of the fire. The problem was where the heat went. Josiah began asking questions that other trappers found strange. Where does the heat go? How fast does wood burn compared to how warm the cabin gets? Why does the area near the fire feel hot while the sleeping area stays frozen? Most men shrugged. That was just how cabins worked. You built a fire, it warmed the immediate area, you accepted the rest. Josiah couldn't accept it anymore. He started paying attention to smoke. Every cabin chimney poured thick smoke that he could see rising hundreds of feet into the winter air. That smoke was hot. He could feel the heat radiating from chimney stones on the exterior of cabins. All that warmth was going outside, heating the forest instead of the men who needed it. The realization seemed obvious once he noticed it, but changing it seemed impossible. Fire created smoke. Smoke needed to escape. Chimneys provided that escape. Remove the chimney and you'd smoke yourself to death inside a sealed cabin. Josiah returned to his own cabin and conducted experiments that would have seemed mad to anyone watching. He built his fire as usual, then moved around the space with his hand extended, feeling for warmth at different heights and distances. Near the floor, even close to the fire, the air felt frigid. At waist height, moderate warmth. At head height, near the fire, uncomfortably hot. The heat was layering, with the warmest air collecting at the ceiling before being sucked up. The chimney. He was heating the space above his head while his feet froze. He tried building a smaller fire, thinking efficiency might help. The cabin grew colder. He tried blocking some of the chimney draft with a flat stone, hoping to slow heat escape. The cabin filled with smoke within minutes. He tried moving his sleeping platform directly beside the fireplace. He could barely sleep from the heat on one side and cold on the other. Every solution he attempted failed because the fundamental design was flawed. Fireplaces were meant to contain fire safely and remove smoke. They were never designed to heat efficiently. Josiah needed something entirely different, but he had no idea what that something might be. Spring came to the Wind River Range in late April of 1839. Josiah had survived the winter alone, burning through twice the firewood a normal trapper would use. He had kept himself alive, but the inefficiency haunted him. As the snow melted and he prepared for the spring trapping season, his attention shifted to something he had never considered important before: underground spaces. Every trapper with a permanent camp built a root cellar if they stayed long enough. These were simple pits dug into hillsides or beneath cabin floors, used for storing food through winter. Josiah had dug his the previous fall, a hole 6 feet deep and 8 feet across, lined with stones to prevent collapse. He had stored potatoes, turnips, and dried meat there throughout the winter. When he descended into it during the coldest weeks, something struck him as odd. The cellar never felt as cold as the air above ground. He started spending time in the root cellar, not for storage purposes, but to observe. Even when surface temperatures dropped below zero, the cellar remained above freezing. Not warm, but noticeably less cold. The earth itself seemed to hold temperature differently than air. He put his hand against the stone walls. They felt cool, but not frozen. He examined the earthen floor. Slightly damp, never frozen solid like the ground surface. The deeper underground he went, the more stable the temperature became. Josiah began investigating other underground features. Natural caves in the hillsides maintained steady temperatures regardless of surface conditions. A small spring that flowed from rocks never froze completely even in January, though the creek it fed turned to ice within 50 yards. Groundhog burrows and bear dens were dug deep for reasons that suddenly seemed obvious. Animals understood something humans had forgotten: the earth insulated and protected. One afternoon in early May, Josiah noticed something that would change everything. He was clearing winter deadfall near his cabin when he found a pile of stones he had stacked the previous fall. The stones had been sitting in full sun all afternoon. Snow still covered the ground in shaded areas, but this pile sat exposed. When Josiah moved one stone to use for another purpose, heat radiated from its surface. The rock was almost too hot to hold comfortably. It had absorbed sunlight all day and now released that heat slowly. He carried the stone inside his cabin and placed it near his sleeping area. 2 hours after sunset, the stone still felt warm to the touch. By morning it had cooled, but the principle was clear. Stone absorbed heat and released it gradually over time. His fireplace stones did the same thing, but all their stored heat was positioned around the fire itself, or in the chimney, warming the outside air. What if he could position heated stones where he needed warmth? What if he could combine the Earth's insulating properties with stone's heat storage? The idea seemed impossible to implement, but it was the first concept that offered hope. Josiah began construction in late May of 1839 when the ground thawed enough to dig. Other trappers who passed his camp that summer thought he had lost his mind. Instead of running trap lines or preparing for the fall season, he was excavating trenches around and beneath his cabin like a man digging his own grave. His plan was radical enough that he didn't bother explaining it to visitors. He would build passages underneath and beside his cabin, line them with stone, and create fires within those passages rather than inside his living space. The stone would absorb heat, the earth would insulate it. The warmth would radiate up through his floor and outward through carefully planned openings. No chimney sending heat into the sky, no smoke filling his cabin. Just stones releasing stored warmth exactly where he needed it. Benjamin Cross stopped by in early June and watched Josiah hauling river stones up from the creek. Benjamin was a practical man who had trapped these mountains for 12 years. He saw Josiah's trenches and half-built stone walls and shook his head. "You, planning to live underground like a badger?" The question wasn't mean-spirited, just confused, Josiah explained. About heat rising, about earth insulation, about thermal mass in stones. Benjamin listened politely and then offered advice. Build a normal cabin, use more chinking, accept that winter is cold. Trying to outsmart nature was how men died doing foolish things. Other trappers who visited echoed Benjamin's concern. A man named William Porter saw the stone-lined tunnel Josiah was building along the north wall of his cabin and asked if he was constructing a tomb. Another trapper, Henry Sims, suggested Josiah had been alone too long and should head to a settlement before he hurt himself. The consensus among experienced mountain men was clear. Josiah Thorne was wasting time and energy on something that couldn't possibly work. Fires belonged in fireplaces. Heat belonged inside cabins. Burying fires under earth and stone would accomplish nothing except creating a complicated way to stay cold. Josiah ignored them. He spent June and July building stone-lined passages that connected to his cabin floor. He dug one main tunnel running 12 feet along the north side, 3 feet deep and 2 feet wide. He lined the bottom with flat stones to create a floor. He built the sidewalls from irregular river stones, each piece fitted carefully against its neighbors. The work was brutal. His hands split and bled. His back ached from lifting stones that weighed 30 and 40 pounds each. He developed calluses on top of calluses. The tunnel progressed slowly, inches per day rather than feet. By August, Benjamin Cross had started referring to Josiah's project as the Hermit's Folly. Other trappers picked up the term. When men gathered to trade supplies or share news, someone would inevitably mention that Crazy Thorne was still digging tunnels and stacking rocks. Most figured he would give up before winter. Some quietly worried he would freeze to death testing his ridiculous theories. None believed it would work. The construction consumed 4 months of relentless work. By September of 1839, Josiah had completed the main tunnel system that would either save his life or prove every skeptic correct. The primary passage ran along the north wall of his cabin, 3 feet deep and 12 feet long. 2 shorter branch tunnels extended at angles, creating a network that would distribute heat beneath nearly half his floor space. The stone walls had been the most demanding aspect. Josiah selected each rock individually from the creek bed, looking for pieces that would stack securely and fit tightly together. He rejected hundreds of stones as too round, too irregular, or too small. The walls needed to be sturdy enough to support earth weight above them and tight enough to contain fire without collapse. He used no mortar, relying entirely on careful fitting and gravity. Each stone was positioned, tested for stability, and adjusted until it locked into place against its neighbors. The timber lintels presented their own challenge. Josiah needed beams strong enough to support the earth and snow that would cover his tunnels. He selected pine logs, 8 inches in diameter, cut them to precise lengths, and shaped flat surfaces where they would rest on the stone walls. These beams would frame the tunnel entrances and prevent collapse when heavy snow accumulated above. He coated each beam with pine pitch to resist rot, a process that took 3 days of boiling sap and applying the sticky resin with a brush made from cattail fibers. The tunnel floors were laid with flat stones chosen for their smooth upper surfaces. Josiah wanted passages he could crawl through if needed, spaces where he could tend fires without burning himself on irregular rock. He filled gaps between floor stones with packed earth, creating level pathways. The earthen base would protect the stones from direct ground frost while providing stable surfaces for fire. Connecting the tunnels to his cabin required removing sections of floor and creating openings that would allow heat rise into the living space. Josiah cut careful holes through his floorboards, positioning them where warmth would distribute most effectively. He built wooden frames around these openings, creating vents that could be partially covered or fully opened depending on how much heat he wanted. The openings were small, each roughly 8 inches square, but positioned strategically near his sleeping area and workspace. The tunnel entrances were built last. These openings needed to be accessible for adding fuel and tending fires, but protected from wind and designed to retain heat. Josiah constructed low, narrow entrances that would eventually be cut into snowbanks. The timber lintels framed the tops, stone walls formed the sides. The openings faced away from prevailing winds and were positioned where snow would accumulate naturally, providing additional insulation. When winter came and snow buried the tunnels, only these small entrances would remain visible, glowing with firelight from within passages that other trappers still considered monuments to foolishness. September ended with Josiah's construction complete and his theory untested. Winter would provide the only verdict that mattered. The first snow fell on October 12, 1839. Light flurries that melted by afternoon, but enough to remind Josiah that testing time approached. He had spent the previous week gathering firewood and preparing his tunnel system for its initial trial. The theoretical principles seemed sound. Stone would absorb heat, earth would insulate, warmth would radiate upward through his floor vents. But theory and reality often diverged in the mountains, and failure would mean a winter of suffering or death. Josiah waited until late October, when nighttime temperatures dropped consistently below freezing. He needed genuine cold to test whether his system provided genuine warmth. On October 24th, he built the first fire in his main tunnel. He started small, unsure how the enclosed space would handle combustion and smoke. He placed kindling on the stone floor 6 feet into the tunnel from the entrance, lit it, and watched carefully. The flames caught and grew. Smoke rose and flowed toward the entrance, drawn by the temperature difference between the tunnel and outside air. Within minutes, the tunnel entrance was exhaling a steady stream of smoke that dissipated into the October evening. Inside the cabin, Josiah knelt beside his floor vents. Warm air was already beginning to rise through the openings. Not the intense heat of a fireplace, but gentle, steady warmth spreading across his floorboards. He added larger pieces of wood. The fire grew. The smoke continued flowing out the entrance without backing into the tunnel. The stone walls around the fire began warming. Josiah could feel the change when he reached into the tunnel. The rocks were absorbing heat exactly as he had hoped. He maintained the fire for 2 hours, then let it burn down to coals, and waited to see what would happen. The warmth continued. Even as the flames died, the heated stones radiated their stored energy. The cabin floor stayed noticeably warm. Josiah placed his hand on the boards above the tunnel. They felt like sun-warmed wood in summer, though outside the temperature was dropping toward 20 degrees. He checked the floor vents. Warm air still rising, gentler now but consistent. The system was working. Over the next 3 weeks, Josiah refined his technique. He learned that fires built in the center section of the tunnel, where stone mass was greatest, provided the best heat distribution. He discovered that smaller, longer-burning fires outperformed large blazes that consumed fuel quickly. He found that closing some floor vents while leaving others open directed warmth where he needed it most. He experimented with different wood types and learned that dense hardwoods, like oak, held heat in the stones longer than fast-burning pine. By mid-November, when the first heavy snow arrived, Josiah was heating his cabin with half the wood he had burned the previous winter. His sleeping area stayed consistently warm. His water bucket never froze. He worked inside wearing a single shirt instead of heavy layers. The system exceeded his hopes, but the real test was still coming. Deep winter would prove whether his tunnel furnace could handle extreme cold. The blizzard struck on January 6, 1840. It began as light snow that afternoon, but intensified after sunset into something far more dangerous. By midnight, the wind was driving snow horizontally with such force that Josiah couldn't see his woodpile 20 feet from his door. The temperature dropped to 15 below zero, then 20 below, then kept falling. This was the kind of storm that killed unprepared men and tested every aspect of frontier survival. Josiah lit fires in 2 of his tunnel sections that evening, knowing the long night ahead would demand sustained heat. He used seasoned oak and maple, woods that burned slow and hot. The flames caught easily despite the brutal cold. Within an hour, the stone walls surrounding the fires were radiating substantial warmth. Heat rose through his floor vents and spread across the cabin interior. Josiah closed his door, secured the latch, and settled in to wait out the storm. The blizzard raged for 36 hours. Wind drove snow into every crack and crevice of structures that weren't perfectly sealed. The temperature dropped to 32 below zero, cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes and make breathing painful. 3 miles away, Benjamin Cross was fighting for survival in his traditional cabin. His fireplace roared with a fire large enough to be dangerous, consuming wood at an alarming rate. The heat rose straight up his chimney. Cold air poured through gaps in his chinking. His water bucket froze solid despite being positioned near the hearth. He wore every piece of clothing he owned and still shivered. By the second night, he was burning furniture, his chair first, then one of his storage shelves. He knew his wood supply wouldn't last another day. Inside Josiah's cabin, conditions were remarkably different. He maintained modest fires in his tunnels, adding wood every few hours, but never creating the massive blazes that traditional fireplaces required. The snow that accumulated over his tunnels, which would have seemed like an enemy to conventional thinking, actually improved his system's performance. The deep snowpack created insulation that trapped heat within the stone passages. The thermal mass of hundreds of stones absorbed the fire's energy and released it gradually through the night. His floor stayed warm enough that he could walk barefoot. The air temperature remained comfortable throughout the space. He wore a single wool shirt and felt perfectly content. On the third morning, the storm broke. Josiah opened his door to find snow drifted 4 feet high against his cabin walls. The sky was crystal clear and brutally cold. He checked his wood supply. He had used perhaps 1/3 of what he would have burned, maintaining a traditional fireplace through the same storm. His tunnel fires had burned down to coals, but the stones still radiated warmth. His cabin was comfortable, while others across the region were desperately cold or worse. Benjamin Cross arrived at Josiah's door that afternoon, frost covering his beard and desperation in his eyes. He had run out of burnable materials and needed help. What he found inside would change his mind about everything. Benjamin Cross stood in the doorway of Josiah's cabin and stared. The temperature outside was 28 below zero. Benjamin wore every layer he owned and still felt the cold penetrating to his bones. Inside the cabin, Josiah sat at his small table wearing a simple wool shirt with his sleeves rolled to his elbows. No fire burned in any visible fireplace. No smoke filled the air, yet the space felt warmer than Benjamin's cabin had ever been, even with a roaring blaze. Benjamin stepped inside and closed the door. The warmth surrounded him immediately, not the intense heat near a fireplace that left your backside freezing, but an even, gentle warmth that seemed to radiate from everywhere at once. He pulled off his mittens and held his hands out, expecting to see a fire he had somehow missed. There was none. The cabin contained no fireplace at all. Just floor vents he had never noticed before, each roughly 8 inches square, with warm air rising from them like breath on a cold morning. Josiah offered Benjamin hot coffee and a place to warm himself. Benjamin accepted both, but couldn't stop looking around the cabin, trying to understand what he was experiencing. He knelt beside one of the floor vents and felt the heat rising from below. Warm air, steady and continuous, coming from beneath the floorboards. He looked at Josiah with confusion that bordered on suspicion. Were you doing this? Where is the fire? Why isn't there smoke? Josiah explained, while Benjamin listened with increasing astonishment. The tunnels beneath and beside the cabin, the stone walls that absorbed heat. The fires built underground, where their warmth was captured by thermal mass instead of lost to the sky. The earth and snow providing insulation. The system that used 1/3 the wood of a traditional fireplace while producing superior heating. Benjamin had dismissed this project as madness 8 months earlier. Now he was standing in proof that he had been completely wrong. Benjamin spent 2 hours in Josiah's cabin that afternoon, asking detailed questions about construction, materials, and technique. Josiah showed him the tunnel entrances outside, now cut into snowbanks with their timber lintels visible and firelight glowing from within the stone passages. He explained how to build the sidewalls, how to position the floor vents, how to manage the fires for maximum efficiency. Benjamin examined everything with the careful attention of a man whose life had nearly ended from cold and who now understood that survival could look completely different than he had imagined. When Benjamin finally prepared to leave, heading back to his own freezing cabin with borrowed firewood, he asked one question that would determine everything that followed. Would Josiah help him build the same system before next winter? Teach him the techniques? Show him the measurements? Guide him through the construction that had seemed so foolish months earlier? Josiah agreed without hesitation. He hadn't developed this system to keep it secret. He had built it to survive, and if others could benefit from what he had learned, that knowledge should be shared freely. Benjamin left that afternoon with more than borrowed wood. He left with plans to completely rebuild his heating system before the following winter arrived. Benjamin Cross began construction on his tunnel system in May of 1840. Josiah spent 3 weeks helping him lay out the passages, select stones, and build the sidewalls that would contain fire beneath Benjamin's cabin floor. The work was slow and demanding, but Benjamin approached it with the intensity of a man who remembered shivering in his own home while furniture burned uselessly in a fireplace. Other trappers saw the construction and asked questions. Some dismissed it as 2 fools instead of 1. Others watched with quiet interest. By the fall of 1840, Benjamin's system was complete. The first cold nights of October proved its worth immediately. His cabin stayed warm with minimal wood consumption. He no longer woke to frost on his blankets. He stopped wearing heavy coats inside his own shelter. The transformation was dramatic enough that even skeptical trappers couldn't ignore it. A trapper named Marcus Webb visited Benjamin's cabin in November and experienced the same shock Benjamin had felt the previous winter. Even warmth, no. Visible fire, impossible comfort in brutal cold. Marcus asked for instruction. Benjamin shared everything Josiah had taught him. The spread happened organically, without promotion or fanfare. Each trapper who built a tunnel system became a demonstration of its effectiveness. Men who had mocked the concept found themselves reconsidering when they visited warm cabins heated by underground fires. The technique moved through the trapping community by simple observation and word of mouth. By the winter of 1841, 7 cabins in the Wind River Range used variations of the tunnel furnace design. By 1843, that number had grown to more than 20. The systems varied based on individual circumstances and available materials. Some trappers built single tunnels along one wall. Others created networks beneath their entire floor space. Some used carefully fitted river stones. Others used whatever rocks they could gather. Some built elaborate multi-chamber designs. Others kept it simple, with straight passages. But the core principles remained consistent across all variations. Stone for thermal mass, earth for insulation, underground fires that radiated heat upward instead of sending it skyward through chimneys. Josiah never claimed credit or sought recognition. When trappers asked who invented the technique, Benjamin and others mentioned Josiah Thorne as the first builder. But Josiah himself deflected such talk. He had simply solved a problem that was killing people. The solution belonged to anyone who needed it. This attitude was common among mountain men who understood that survival knowledge saved lives and hoarding it served no purpose. Information about good trapping locations, dangerous terrain, reliable water sources, and effective construction techniques flowed freely through the scattered community, because keeping such knowledge private made no sense in a place where everyone faced the same harsh realities. By 1845, tunnel furnaces had spread beyond the Wind River Range into other parts of the Rocky Mountain region. Trappers traveling between areas carried the knowledge with them. Traders mentioned the technique when they moved through different territories. The innovation became part of the standard knowledge base that experienced mountain men shared with newcomers, taught with the same casual practicality as how to set beaver traps or read weather signs in cloud formations. Josiah Thorne left the Wind River Range in the spring of 1846. The fur trade was collapsing as fashion shifted away from beaver, felt hats, and populations of animals declined from decades of intensive trapping. Men who had spent years in the mountains were heading to Oregon, California, or back to settlements in the east. Josiah was 34 years old and ready for a different life. He sold his trapping equipment, packed his few possessions, and walked away from the cabin that had kept him alive through 7 winters. He never returned to the mountains. He settled in the Willamette Valley of Oregon Territory, married a widow named Catherine, who had lost her husband on the trail west, and established a small farm where he grew wheat and raised cattle. He had children, 3 daughters who grew up knowing their father had once been a mountain man, but never hearing the specific details of his innovations. Josiah didn't talk much about those years. When asked, he would say he had trapped beaver and survived winters. Nothing more. The tunnel furnaces he had pioneered were never mentioned in his later life. But in the mountains, the legacy persisted in stone and earth. Cabins with underground heating systems continued functioning long after their original builders left or died. Settlers moving west in the 1850s discovered abandoned structures with mysterious stone-lined tunnels and warm interiors even in winter. Some recognized the brilliance of the design and maintained the systems. Others modified them or built their own variations. A few assumed they had found natural hot springs until they examined the construction and realized these were human-made heating networks. The technique gradually merged into broader frontier building knowledge. By the 1860s, homesteaders in cold regions sometimes incorporated underground heating passages into their construction, though most didn't know the origin of the concept. The specific story of Josiah Thorne and Daniel Frost was forgotten. The names of Benjamin Cross and the other early adopters faded from memory. What remained were functional systems that kept people alive and a general understanding that fires didn't have to burn inside living spaces to provide warmth. Josiah died in 1872 at age 60 on his Oregon farm. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his successful farming operation and surviving family members. Nothing about beaver trapping or mountain survival. He was buried in a cemetery outside Salem with a simple stone marker bearing his name and dates. The tunnel system beneath his abandoned Wyoming cabin still functioned, used by whoever happened to be occupying the structure that season. The stones he had carefully fitted still radiated heat. The timber lintels he had positioned still framed the entrances. The innovation he had created from grief and necessity continued doing what it was designed to do. Modern historians researching frontier heating methods occasionally find references to underground stone tunnels in settler journals and trapper accounts from the 1840s and 50s. The documentation is scattered and incomplete. No single inventor is consistently named. The innovation appears to have developed organically across multiple locations, which is how most frontier techniques emerged. A few scholars have noted unusually sophisticated heating systems in certain Rocky Mountain cabin sites. but the connection to Josiah Thorne's original construction remains obscure. The physical evidence endures in abandoned cabins where stone passages still snake beneath rotted floorboards, silent testimony to engineering that prioritized survival over recognition and shared knowledge over personal glory.